On the morning of April 29, 1945, a column of American soldiers approached a set of iron gates in southern Bavaria. They had fought their way across France, through the Hürtgen forest, across the Rhine, and into the heart of a dying Reich. They were hardened men, veterans of some of the most brutal combat of the Second World War. They had seen friends killed, towns reduced to rubble, and the wreckage of a continent that had torn itself apart. They thought they had seen everything war could produce. They were wrong. What those soldiers found behind the gates of Dachau concentration camp that April morning would haunt them for the rest of their lives, reshape the final chapter of the war in Europe, and ignite a controversy that historians, veterans, and moralists still argue about today. Because what American soldiers did when they found Dachau was not simply liberate the camp. Some of them opened fire on the guards who ran it. And in the chaos, the shock, and the raw fury of that day, the line between justice and vengeance was erased in ways that nobody who was there would ever fully be able to explain. So what exactly happened at Dachau on April 29, 1945? Who were the soldiers involved? What did they find? What did they do? And what happened afterward, when the army tried to investigate and then quietly made the whole thing go away? In this video, we are going to find out. So without further ado, let's start from the very beginning. To understand what happened on that April morning, you first need to understand what Dachau was and what it represented. Dachau was the first concentration camp established by the Nazi regime. It opened on March 22, 1933, just weeks after Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, and it did not close until American soldiers kicked open its gates more than 12 years later. It sat on the grounds of a former munitions factory about 10 miles northwest of Munich, in the heart of Bavaria, the cradle of the Nazi movement. From the very beginning, Dachau served as a model. Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief who would eventually oversee a system of murder that killed millions, used Dachau as a template for every camp that came afterward. The administrative structure, the guard system, the brutal discipline, the dehumanizing routines, all of it was refined at Dachau and then exported across occupied Europe. It was a school of terror, and its graduates ran the most lethal bureaucracy in human history. In its earliest years, Dachau held political prisoners, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and clergy who had spoken out against the regime. Over time, its population expanded to include Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and eventually prisoners of war from across Europe and the Soviet Union. By the war's final years, it had become a vast complex of suffering, with dozens of subcamps spread across Bavaria and Austria, all of them feeding labour and misery into the machinery of the Third Reich. The camp's population swelled as the war turned against Germany, and the SS frantically moved prisoners westward to avoid them falling into Allied hands. By April 1945, Dachau held somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 prisoners in conditions that defied description. The administration of the camp was in the hands of the SS, specifically the SS Totenkopfverbände, or Death's Head units, whose sole function was the operation of the concentration camp system. The guards at Dachau were not ordinary soldiers. They were men who had volunteered for, or been assigned to, a role that required them to participate in systematic brutality as a daily function of their employment. Their tools were clubs and dogs and arbitrary punishment and starvation. Their product was human degradation. For 12 years, they had operated with absolute impunity, answerable only to their SS superiors, shielded from the outside world by barbed wire and secrecy. They had grown accustomed to their power. They had grown comfortable with what they did. That comfort was about to meet something it was entirely unprepared for. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Red Army was fighting its way into Berlin. American forces had crossed the Rhine and were sweeping through Bavaria at remarkable speed. On the ground, soldiers of the United States Army were moving faster than their supply lines could keep pace, liberating town after town, encountering dazed and surrendering German troops, and beginning to stumble across the physical evidence of what the Nazi regime had actually been. They had heard rumours. Intelligence officers had briefed them on what to expect, but briefings and rumours could not prepare a human being for reality. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen by British forces on April 15th had already sent shockwaves through the Allied command structure and the press. Now it was the Americans' turn. The unit that would make history at Dachau was the 45th Infantry Division, one of the most decorated American divisions of the entire war. The 45th was a National Guard division drawn primarily from Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. It had earned its battle stripes the hard way, landing at Sicily in July 1943 and fighting its way up through Italy before being withdrawn and hurled into the landings in southern France in August 1944. From there, the Thunderbirds, as they were known, had driven north through France, crossed the Rhine in late March 1945, and entered Bavaria, pushing toward Munich. They were experienced, they were battle-tested, and they were tired in the bone-deep way that only years of combat can produce. Alongside them, elements of the 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, were also converging on Dachau on the morning of April 29th. Within the 45th Division, the regiment that would reach the camp first was the 157th Infantry Regiment, and within that regiment one officer would become the central figure in the events of that day. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, and his story is as important to understanding what happened at Dachau as the events themselves. Felix Leroy Sparks was born on August 4, 1917 in McNairy, Arizona, a small copper mining town in the mountains near the New Mexico border. He was the son of a rancher, and he grew up in a world of hard physical work, wide open spaces, and the kind of self-reliance that the American Southwest tends to produce. He attended the University of Arizona before the war and had begun studying law. When the United States entered World War II following Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Sparks was commissioned as an infantry officer. He had risen through the ranks of the 157th Infantry Regiment during years of continuous combat, and by the spring of 1945 he was commanding the regiment's 3rd Battalion and effectively functioning as a senior tactical commander. Sparks was known among his men as a tough but fair officer. He had seen friends and soldiers die, in Sicily, at Anzio, in southern France, and all the way up through Germany. He had been wounded in combat. He carried the weight of command in the way that combat veterans do, as a constant awareness of responsibility for the lives of the men around him. On April 29, 1945, he would face a challenge that no amount of military training or battlefield experience could have prepared him for. He would have to decide in real time what kind of men his soldiers were going to be in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The approach to Dachau that morning began under a grey Bavarian sky. Sparks's battalion was moving through the outskirts of the town of Dachau itself when advance scouts reported something extraordinary ahead of them. Sitting on a rail siding just outside the main camp complex was a train. Not an ordinary train, a train of 50 cars stretching hundreds of yards along the track, and inside those cars were bodies. Thousands of them. Emaciated, contorted, piled on top of one another, dressed in the striped uniforms of concentration camp prisoners. Some appeared to have died of disease or starvation. Others bore wounds that suggested they had been shot. The train, it would later be determined, had originated at the Buchenwald concentration camp complex in central Germany and had been moving westward for weeks as the SS attempted to evacuate prisoners ahead of the Allied advance. Along the way, the prisoners aboard had died at a staggering rate, with no food, no water, no sanitation, and no care of any kind. Those who survived the journey were in no condition to walk or speak. The soldiers of the 157th Infantry who first encountered this train stopped and stared in disbelief. These were men who had walked through the aftermath of artillery barrages, who had seen the bodies of their comrades left on frozen ground, who had witnessed the physical destruction of combat in its most intimate forms. Nothing had prepared them for this. The smell hit them. First, a wall of decay and death that veterans would describe decades later as something they could never get out of their memory. Then came the visual reality. Car after car after car of human beings who had been reduced to the state of objects, discarded, stacked, left to rot in the open air of a Bavarian spring. One soldier who was present, William Cowling of the 42nd Division, wrote in a letter home that day that the sight was the most horrible thing he had ever seen in his life, that the bodies were skin and bones, that the cars were covered in filth and blood, and that he simply could not find words adequate to what he was looking at. He was not alone in that inadequacy. The psychological effect on the soldiers was immediate and profound. The shock was physical as well as emotional. Men who had been moving in combat formation, operating with the professional focus that their training demanded, were suddenly confronted with evidence of a crime so vast and so methodical that their minds struggled to process it. Some soldiers wept, Others turned away and were sick. Some stood motionless for minutes at a time. The men of the 157th Infantry and the other units converging on Dachau that morning were experiencing something that had no precedent in their personal or military experience, and the emotional response it triggered was correspondingly extreme. And they were only at the train siding. They had not yet entered the camp itself. As the American soldiers moved past the death train and through the outer perimeter of the Dachau complex, they encountered the first of what would be a series of increasingly horrifying discoveries. The camp was enormous by any measure. It covered hundreds of acres and included not only the original prisoner compound, but barracks for the SS garrison, administrative buildings, workshops, a crematorium, and extensive fencing, guard towers, and security infrastructure. The outer camp, known as the SS Übungsgelände, or training area, held the garrison buildings and support facilities. The inner compound, the Schutzhaftlager, or protective custody camp, was where the prisoners were held. Between these two zones, in the area near the gatehouse and the main administration building, the Americans encountered their first SS personnel. Some of the guards at Dachau had already fled in the days before the liberation, understanding well what their fate would likely be when American forces arrived. The camp's last commandant, SS Hauptsturmführer Martin Weiss, had already departed, leaving a reduced garrison behind. The man on the spot when the Americans arrived was SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Wicker, a young officer who had been left in charge with orders to surrender the camp. With him was a delegation that included the Red Cross representative Victor Maurer, who had arrived in the preceding days to negotiate the camp's handover and try to protect the remaining prisoners from a massacre in the final hours before liberation. The formal surrender of Dachau was complicated by the fact that two different American units arrived simultaneously through different approaches, and their commanders had not fully coordinated their movements. Brigadier General Henning Linden of the 42nd Infantry Division was in one approach column, accompanied by war correspondents, including the journalist Marguerite Higgins of the New York Herald Tribune. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks and his battalion were coming from another direction. The result was a degree of confusion at the camp's entrance that had real consequences for what happened next. Henning Linden was a career army officer who had commanded elements of the 42nd Division through the fighting in France and Germany. He was at the front of his column when the delegation led by Wicker and Maurer came out to meet the American forces at the camp's entrance. The formal surrender was somewhat chaotic. Marguerite Higgins, whose presence as a female war correspondent in a combat zone was itself highly unusual, later wrote about the moment the gates opened and the prisoners poured out, so weak that some fell immediately, reaching for the Americans, touching their uniforms and weapons with disbelief. What she described was not a liberation in the organised, orderly sense that the word might suggest. It was a collision between the dying world of Nazi captivity and the arriving world of American power, and neither side quite knew how to behave in the moment of contact. But while the formal surrender was occurring at the main gate, something very different was happening inside the camp. The soldiers of Felix Sparks' battalion had entered through a different part of the perimeter and were making their way through the SS garrison area toward the prisoner compound. And as they moved through the camp, they were encountering SS guards and garrison personnel who had not escaped and who had not yet surrendered. What happened next, at a location that would become known as the Coal Yard, or the Worm River Canal, became one of the most debated episodes of the final weeks of World War II in Europe. Inside the SS garrison area, adjacent to the prisoner compound, there was a section of the camp near the coal storage area where a group of SS guards had gathered. The exact number of guards present is a matter of historical dispute that has never been fully resolved, with estimates ranging from a few dozen to over 100. These men were in various states of preparation. Some appear to have been attempting to surrender, others may have been armed. Some were wounded. The circumstances that led to what happened next unfolded in a matter of minutes, compressed by the chaos of military operations, the overpowering emotional impact of what the soldiers had already witnessed, and the complete absence of any clear protocol for this unprecedented situation. Soldiers from the 157th Infantry opened fire on the SS guards in the coal yard area. The shooting was not a battle in any conventional military sense. It was an execution. Guards who had raised their hands, who were standing against walls or lying on the ground, were shot. The episode was over quickly, but it was not the only incident of its kind at Dachau that day. Across the camp, as American soldiers moved through the various sections of the complex and encountered SS personnel, shootings occurred that would later be documented, investigated, and ultimately suppressed. The question of exactly how many SS guards were killed by American soldiers at Dachau on April 29, 1945, became one of the most contentious historical questions surrounding the liberation, and it remains disputed to this day. The most commonly cited figure in contemporary accounts is that somewhere between 17 and 43 SS guards were killed by American soldiers at Dachau in what were clearly extrajudicial circumstances, meaning they were killed after surrendering or while attempting to surrender rather than in active combat. However, some accounts have claimed far higher numbers. Howard Buechner, a former Army medical officer who was present at Dachau, published a book decades after the war in which he claimed that 520 SS guards were executed, a figure that historians have largely rejected as wildly inflated and unsupported by the documentary evidence. The Army's own investigation, conducted in the weeks following the liberation, concluded that the number of guards killed in questionable circumstances was in the range of 17 to 40, though the investigation was ultimately suppressed before it could produce formal charges. Felix Sparks was in the coal yard area when some of the shootings took place. What he did there is one of the clearest documented moments of the day, and it tells you something important about who he was as a man and as a soldier. When Sparks arrived in the coal yard and saw what was happening, he drew his pistol and fired it into the air. He physically intervened to stop his soldiers from continuing to shoot. He ordered them to cease fire. He later described the moment in interviews and written accounts as one of the most difficult of his life, because he understood both the impulse that was driving his soldiers and the moral and military necessity of stopping them. He had to impose order on men whose capacity for order had been temporarily overwhelmed by what they had experienced that morning. That he succeeded in doing so, at least partially, is a testament to both his authority and his character. In his own recollections of the event, Sparks was remarkably candid about the emotional landscape of that day. He had entered the prisoner compound and seen the survivors. He had walked past the crematorium and its associated structures. He had witnessed the state of the human beings who had been kept in Dachau for years, and he understood, viscerally and immediately, what the SS guards who were now his prisoners had been part of. He felt the same rage that his soldiers felt. The difference was that he managed barely to keep that rage from entirely overcoming his judgment. In later years, he would say that what he saw at Dachau was the worst thing he had ever experienced in the war, worse than any combat, worse than any battlefield, because at least in battle, the killing had a military logic to it. What he saw at Dachau had no logic at all except the logic of pure human evil. The prisoners themselves were in a state that the American soldiers were completely unprepared for medically or logistically. The camp held tens of thousands of individuals in varying degrees of malnutrition and disease. Typhus was rampant. Dysentery was widespread. Many prisoners were so weakened that they could not stand. The crematorium, which American soldiers entered and documented, bore horrific witness to the camp's final weeks, when the machinery of death had been running at full capacity even as Germany's military position collapsed around it. The gas chamber at Dachau, a facility that the SS had constructed, but whose use for mass killing remains a matter of historical debate among scholars, was also documented by American investigators in the days following liberation. The soldiers assigned to deal with the immediate aftermath of liberation were doing something that had no name yet, and no training manual. Army medical personnel set up emergency treatment facilities and began the overwhelming task of trying to provide medical care to thousands of desperately ill and injured people, many of whom were so physically depleted that even the arrival of food and water could prove fatal if administered too quickly and without care. The soldiers guarded the perimeter and processed the surrendered SS garrison. Intelligence officers began the work of cataloguing documents, identifying staff members, and collecting evidence of what had happened at Dachau over the preceding 12 years. And journalists, including Marguerite Higgins and reporters from other outlets who were arriving on the heels of the combat units, were documenting everything they could. Marguerite Higgins deserves particular attention in any account of Dachau's liberation because her presence and her reporting shaped public understanding of the event in the immediate aftermath. Born in Hong Kong in 1920 to an American father and a French mother, Higgins had become a war correspondent for the New York Herald-Tribune and had demonstrated a relentless determination to cover the front lines that put her repeatedly at odds with military commanders who were reluctant to allow women into combat zones. She had pushed her way into some of the most dangerous reporting situations of the European theatre, and her presence at Dachau was the result of exactly that kind of determined manoeuvring. Her account of the liberation, published in the days following April 29th, was one of the first detailed eyewitness reports to reach American newspaper readers, and it conveyed something of the raw, unmanageable reality of what the soldiers and survivors had experienced. Higgins described the moment when the prisoners realized the Americans were really there, when the disbelief gave way and the survivors began to move toward the gates. She wrote about men so thin they appeared skeletal, reaching through the wire, calling out in a dozen languages, some weeping, some unable to speak at all. She described soldiers who stood there receiving this outpouring of desperate human gratitude with expressions of stunned confusion, because nothing in their experience of war had included this kind of encounter. The liberation of Dachau was not like anything that had come before it, and the soldiers who experienced it carried it inside them in ways they did not fully understand until decades later, when some of them began to speak about it publicly for the first time. Within hours of the liberation, word had spread through the command chain and was beginning to move up to the highest levels of the American military in Europe. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, had already arranged to personally visit the newly liberated camp at Buchenwald with Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. He understood the importance of having senior commanders bear witness to what had happened in these places, both for the historical record and for the practical purpose of ensuring that the full reality of the Nazi death camp system could not later be denied or minimized. His response to what he saw at similar camps was to order that as many soldiers as possible be brought through them so that they could testify as eyewitnesses to future generations. At Dachau, the senior officer who arrived to take stock of the situation in the days immediately following liberation was General Patton himself. George Smith Patton Jr., commanding the 3rd United States Army, was one of the most flamboyant and controversial commanders of the entire war. His tactical brilliance in armoured warfare was matched by a personal abrasiveness and a tendency towards statements and actions that repeatedly brought him into conflict with his superiors. He had already been in trouble for slapping hospitalized soldiers suffering from combat stress. He would later famously make statements about post-war denazification that earned him censure. His response to the Dachau killings was complicated in ways that reflect his complicated personality. Patton visited Dachau and inspected the camp in the days following liberation. By multiple accounts, he was physically sickened by what he saw, so much so that he was barely able to complete the inspection tour. He later recorded in his diary that the camp was the most horrible thing he had ever seen. A man who had commanded armies across 2 continents and presided over some of the most intense fighting of the war, who was by any measure personally acquainted with death and violence on a massive scale, found the evidence of Dachau's operation overwhelming. That says something important about the gap between what the soldiers expected and what they found. But Patton's reaction to the killings of SS guards was more ambivalent. When the Army's investigation into what had happened at the coal yard and elsewhere in the camp began, it was Patton who had the authority to determine whether charges would ultimately be brought against the soldiers involved. He was not sympathetic to the idea of prosecuting American soldiers for what they had done. His view, expressed in private, if not always publicly, was that the men who had killed SS guards at Dachau were responding in a human way to an inhuman situation, and that prosecuting them for it would be both unjust and deeply damaging to morale. Whether that assessment was motivated by genuine sympathy for his soldiers, by a political calculation about the optics of prosecuting liberators, or by some combination of the two, is something historians have debated ever since. The Army's official investigation was assigned to the Inspector General's office and was conducted with some thoroughness in the weeks following the liberation. Investigators interviewed soldiers, collected witness statements, and tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to the deaths of SS guards. The investigation produced a report that detailed specific incidents and named specific individuals who were identified as having participated in the killings. It was a real investigation, not a whitewash, at least in its initial stages. Felix Sparks himself was interviewed. He described what he had seen and what he had done, including his intervention to stop the shooting. The soldiers who had done the shooting gave their own accounts, shaped by the still raw memory of what they had experienced and by the awareness that they were under investigation. The investigation ultimately concluded that there was sufficient evidence to bring charges against several soldiers, including at least one officer, for the killing of SS guards who had surrendered. The charges contemplated included violations of the laws of war, which even in 1945 prohibited the killing of prisoners of war or enemy combatants who had laid down their arms. The army was, in principle, prepared to proceed. What stopped it was a combination of factors, some legal, some political, and some simply human. At the centre of this decision was the authority of General Patton. Patton chose not to forward the investigation's recommendations for prosecution. In doing so, he effectively killed the case. His justification, to the extent that it was formalized at all, was that the soldiers had acted under extreme provocation and in circumstances that made their behavior, while technically outside the bounds of military law, understandable in human terms. The men who had killed SS guards at Dachau had done so in the immediate aftermath of seeing the death train, the crematorium, the gas chamber, and the living skeletons of the surviving prisoners. To prosecute them for that response, Patton seems to have concluded, was more than the situation warranted. The investigation was suppressed. No charges were ever filed. The soldiers involved were not punished, and for decades afterward, what had happened at Dachau on April 29, 1945, existed in a peculiar historical limbo. Documented but not officially acknowledged, known to those who were there but not discussed in the official histories. That silence began to break down slowly, starting in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s as veterans aged and historians gained access to previously classified documents, and as the soldiers themselves, approaching the end of their lives, began to speak about what they had experienced. Felix Sparks was among those who eventually gave detailed testimony. He spoke to historians, participated in documentary projects, and wrote his own memoir of his wartime service. His account of Dachau was consistently candid and consistently troubled. The account of a man who had done the right thing under impossible circumstances and who had spent decades processing what he had witnessed and what his soldiers had done. The story of Dachau's liberation is not a simple story, and the events of April 29, 1945 do not resolve into a simple moral. That is precisely what makes it so historically important. What happened at Dachau that day was a collision between several different kinds of reality. The reality of what the Nazi concentration camp system had been and done. The reality of what combat soldiers are and what they can and cannot process under extreme emotional stress. The reality of military law and its application in the fog and fury of a dying war. And the reality of how nations and armies construct narratives about themselves and their conduct, and what they choose to remember and what they choose to forget. To understand Dachau's liberation fully, you need to look at all of these dimensions. And to do that, you need to look closely at the individuals who were there, both the Americans and the Germans, and trace their stories from the moment the gates opened to the ends of their lives. Let us begin with Felix Sparks himself, because his biography is the spine of this story, and because his life after Dachau is as remarkable in its own way as his conduct on the day itself. Felix Leroy Sparks was born into a working-class family in the small mining community of McNairy, Arizona, in August 1917, and his early years gave little obvious indication that he would become one of the most significant American military figures of the war's final weeks in Europe. His father worked in the copper mines, and the family lived modestly in a community that was, by any measure, far removed from the centers of American power and culture. Sparks grew up riding horses, working on the family ranch, and developing the kind of practical self-reliance that the American Southwest demands of those who live there honestly. He was physically capable, mentally sharp, and possessed of a temperament that leaned toward quiet competence, rather than flamboyant display. He attended the University of Arizona in the late 1930s, studying law, and it was there that the approach of war found him. He received his commission as a second lieutenant in the Army in 1942 and was assigned to the 45th Infantry Division, the National Guard formation that would become his military home for the duration of his active service. His rise through the ranks of the 157th Infantry Regiment was driven by proven competence in the field. The 45th Division landed in Sicily in July 1943 as part of Operation Husky, and Sparks was there learning the brutal trade of infantry combat in the heat and dust of the Sicilian summer. The fighting in Sicily was intense and costly, with German forces conducting a skilled fighting withdrawal that kept the Allies engaged in difficult terrain. Sparks showed under these conditions the qualities that would define his command style: tactical clarity, personal courage, and an ability to maintain focus on the mission without losing sight of the cost that focus imposed on his men. From Sicily, the 45th Division transitioned to the Italian mainland, landing at Salerno in September 1943 as part of the Allied push up the Italian peninsula. The Italian campaign was one of the most grueling of the entire European war, a slog through mountainous terrain against determined German defenders who made the Allies pay for every mile. Sparks fought through the winter at Anzio, the desperate Allied beachhead south of Rome, where American and British forces were pinned down for months in a narrow coastal strip under constant German pressure. Anzio was particularly savage, a place where artillery fire was constant and where survival often came down to inches and luck. Soldiers who survived Anzio carried a particular kind of battle hardening that those who had not been there found difficult to fully comprehend. After the breakout from Anzio and the fall of Rome in June 1944, the 45th Division was withdrawn from Italy for retraining and refitting in preparation for a new operation. On August 15, 1944, Sparks waded ashore on the beaches of southern France as part of Operation Dragoon, the Allied landing on the French Riviera that opened a second front against Germany from the south. The drive north through France was rapid at first, as German forces reeled from the pressure of simultaneous Allied advances from Normandy in the north and the Mediterranean coast in the south. The Thunderbirds moved through the Rhône Valley, liberating French cities and towns, and then turned northward into the Vosges Mountains, where the fighting once again became slow, cold, and costly. The autumn and winter of 1944 to 1945 in the Vosges Mountains and along the German border was one of the most difficult periods of the entire campaign for the soldiers of the 45th Division. They fought in brutal cold, often in dense forest terrain that negated many of the advantages American forces enjoyed in more open country. German resistance was fierce, and the casualty rates climbed steadily. Sparks was by this point commanding at the battalion level, and the weight of those losses was personal and immediate in the way that only battalion command makes it. Every soldier under his command was someone he knew, or someone he was responsible for knowing, and the accumulation of deaths over more than 2 years of combat had produced in him, as in many veterans of his experience level, a kind of profound moral seriousness about the purpose of the fighting and the cost of the suffering it entailed. When the 45th Division finally crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and drove into Bavaria, Sparks was a soldier stripped of any illusions about war, but not stripped of his ability to function within it. The journey from the Rhine to Dachau took about 6 weeks. The advance through Bavaria was often rapid, with German resistance becoming increasingly disorganized as the Reich's command structure disintegrated. But it was not without fighting. American soldiers were still dying in firefights and ambushes right up to the final days of the war, and the bizarre coexistence of organized German resistance in some areas and complete collapse in others made tactical judgment perpetually difficult. Sparks's battalion was moving fast and hard in late April 1945, and when the first reports came in about a concentration camp ahead of them in the town of Dachau, northwest of Munich, the initial reaction was that this was simply another objective to be taken and secured. The true nature of what they were about to encounter was something that no intelligence briefing had fully conveyed. The death train, that horrifying parade of 50 rail cars loaded with corpses, was the first thing that broke through the soldiers' professional armour. Private First Class John Lee, a soldier in the 45th Division who was among those who first approached the train, later gave testimony about the experience that became one of the canonical accounts of the liberation. Lee described walking along the train and looking into car after car, seeing bodies in the striped uniforms, seeing the evidence of how those men had died, and feeling something happen inside him that he did not have words for at the time, and struggled to find words for throughout the rest of his life. He was not alone in that response. The men who encountered the death train were changed by the experience in ways that were immediate and indelible. What had been an abstraction, something terrible happening to unknown people in a distant place, was suddenly physical and immediate and overpowering. These were not statistics. These were human bodies, and they had been left here by human beings, who were still, in some cases, on the premises. This is the crucial psychological context for everything that followed inside the camp. The soldiers who entered Dachau on April 29, 1945, did so already having absorbed a shock that would have been catastrophic even without anything else. And Dachau itself had more to show them. The prisoner compound, when the Americans finally entered it, presented scenes that no combination of words, photographs, or film footage can fully convey to someone who was not present. The survivors, those who were alive and capable of any movement at all, came forward in numbers and in states of physical devastation that stunned the Americans who saw them. These were people who had been systematically starved, worked, beaten, and subjected to medical experiments for years. Their bodies bore the evidence of that treatment in every dimension. Skeletal thinness, hollowed faces, eyes that had seen things beyond the capacity of the Americans' prior imagination to encompass. The crematorium facility at Dachau was another point of encounter that altered the soldiers who experienced it. The building contained ovens that had been used to dispose of the bodies of prisoners who had died in the camp, and in the final chaotic weeks before liberation, when the camp population had been swollen by the arrival of thousands of evacuees from other camps, the crematorium had been running continuously. American soldiers who entered the facility found evidence that needed no explanation. They found the ovens. They found bone fragments. They found the administrative documentation of industrialized death. They also found in areas adjacent to the crematorium piles of bodies that the facility had not yet processed when the Americans arrived. The guards had simply run out of time. It was in this context, having already encountered the death train and now moving through the evidence of systematic mass murder on an industrial scale, that the soldiers of the 45th Division came into contact with the SS guards and garrison personnel who remained in the camp, and it was in this context that the question of what soldiers do when they encounter the perpetrators of something like this, not in the abstract, not in a courtroom, not separated by time and distance, but immediately, personally, with the smell of death still in the air and the survivors still reaching toward them from the other side of wire, becomes one of the most difficult moral questions in modern military history. The coal yard incident, which is the most extensively documented of the killings that occurred at Dachau on April 29th, took place in the SS garrison area of the camp near a section that had been used for coal storage. The details of exactly what happened have been reconstructed from multiple sources, including Sparks's own testimony, the Army's investigation, statements from soldiers who were present, and the accounts of journalists and other witnesses who arrived in the area shortly afterward. The picture that emerges is one of compressed, almost instantaneous, moral catastrophe. A group of SS guards, the exact number varying by account but generally cited as somewhere between 24 and 50 men, had gathered in or near the coal yard area. Some of these men were attempting to surrender. They were in various postures of submission, some with hands raised, some lying on the ground. American soldiers from the 157th Infantry converged on this group and opened fire. The shooting was not the result of combat, not a firefight in which guards were firing at Americans or presenting any clear threat. It was the killing of men who had already effectively surrendered, carried out by soldiers who had just walked past the death train and through the prisoner compound and past the crematorium. The killings were fast. They were comprehensive. And they represented, by any reading of the laws of war as they existed in 1945, a war crime committed by American soldiers. Felix Sparks reached the coal yard and heard the shooting. He ran to the scene. What he found was a machine gun that one of his soldiers had positioned against a wall with a group of SS men gathered near it. Some of the guards were already dead or dying. Sparks drew his Colt .45 pistol and fired it into the air. He physically interposed himself between the machine gun and the remaining prisoners. He screamed at the soldiers to stop firing. His intervention was effective. The shooting stopped. In the aftermath, he attempted to restore order, directing soldiers to guard the surviving SS prisoners and securing the area. He was shaken by his own account, both by what had happened and by the broader context that had produced it. Sparks later wrote about this moment with a directness that is unusual in accounts of wartime excess. He did not excuse what his soldiers had done. He did not claim that it was justified by what they had seen. He acknowledged that it was wrong by the standards he believed in and by the standards of military law. But he also described the emotional reality that had produced it, and he asked the question that no simple moral calculus can fully answer. What do you expect of a human being, placed in those circumstances, carrying that burden, confronting that evidence face to face with the men responsible for it? He didn't ask that question as a justification. He asked it as a genuine inquiry into the limits of human moral capability under extreme stress. The other incidents of killing that occurred at Dachau on April 29th were less centrally documented, but no less real. Across the camp, as American soldiers moved through various sections and encountered SS personnel, shootings occurred. The Army's investigation subsequently identified a number of specific incidents in different parts of the camp and estimated a total of somewhere between 17 and 40 SS guards killed in circumstances that constituted violations of the laws of war. The exact number has never been definitively established. Some accounts from soldiers and witnesses suggest higher numbers, though the most extreme claims of several hundred killed have been rejected by virtually all serious historians. One dimension of this that is often overlooked in accounts focused on the Coal Yard incident is the involvement of camp survivors in some of the killings. As the American soldiers moved through the camp, and as the prisoners began to understand that liberation had truly arrived, some of the surviving prisoners, those with enough physical capacity to act, turned on the SS guards and capos who had tormented them. There were beatings and killings carried out by former prisoners in the chaos of liberation that were separate from anything the American soldiers did. The American soldiers who witnessed these acts generally did not intervene, a decision that can be understood in human terms but which again raised questions about military responsibility and the application of law in chaotic circumstances. The liberation of Dachau was not a clean event. It was a human event in all the complexity and darkness that implies. Brigadier General Henning Linden's role in the day's events is another dimension that deserves detailed examination. Linden was the senior American officer at the point where the formal surrender of the camp was effected, and his presence alongside Marguerite Higgins and other journalists meant that the official surrender was witnessed and documented in a way that some of the other events of the day were not. Linden accepted the surrender from the SS delegation led by Heinrich Wicker and accompanying Red Cross representative Victor Maurer. The ceremony, such as it was, took place amid conditions of considerable chaos, with other American soldiers converging from multiple directions and thousands of prisoners beginning to move through the camp in the aftermath of liberation. Linden was later questioned about the killings that had occurred during the liberation and was criticized by some for his handling of the situation. He maintained that he had not been in a position to directly observe or control what had happened in the SS garrison area, which was being handled by a different unit. His account of the day focused primarily on the formal surrender and the initial organization of the camp's administration, and he was less forthcoming about the darker episodes than Sparks eventually was. His career continued after the war without significant disruption, and he retired from the army in due course, the formal surrender at Dachau a significant entry on his record, but the killings that accompanied it something he had moved past. Victor Maurer, the Red Cross representative who had been in the camp for several days before the Americans arrived, had negotiated with the SS in an attempt to ensure a peaceful handover and protect the surviving prisoners from a last-minute massacre. His presence at Dachau in those final days, operating in an impossible position between an SS command that was still technically in authority and a population of tens of thousands of desperately ill prisoners, was an act of considerable personal courage. When the Americans arrived, Maurer was instrumental in facilitating the formal surrender and in helping American officers understand the administrative structure of the camp and the immediate medical needs of the survivors. His account of the liberation, provided to Swiss Red Cross officials in the days afterward, is one of the more measured and detailed primary sources for the events of April 29th, and it includes his observations of the killings of SS guards, which he witnessed partially and which horrified him even as he understood the emotional logic that had produced them. The role of war correspondents in shaping the historical record of Dachau's liberation cannot be overstated. In addition to Marguerite Higgins, a number of other journalists were present at or arrived shortly after the liberation, and their accounts formed the public understanding of the event in the immediate aftermath. The army had also deployed its own photographers and cameramen, who documented the camp in extraordinary detail. The photographs taken at Dachau on April 29, 1945, and in the days following became some of the most widely published images of the entire war. They appeared in newspapers and magazines across the United States and the Allied world, and they confronted civilian populations with visual evidence of what the Nazi regime had actually done, that no amount of reporting alone could have conveyed. General Eisenhower, who who visited the nearby Ohrdruf camp and other liberated sites and who ordered extensive documentation efforts, understood that the photographic record was crucial, not just for the immediate purposes of war crimes prosecution, but for the long-term historical record. He is quoted as having said that he wanted the evidence, documented so thoroughly that no one in the future could claim that it had not happened. His foresight on this point has been vindicated by the subsequent history of Holocaust denial, but the photographs also captured aspects of the liberation that were complicated from a military perspective, including, in some cases, evidence of the killings of SS guards. The Army Signal Corps photographers at Dachau documented the death train, the prisoner compound, the crematorium, and the survivors. Some of their photographs also captured the aftermath of the killings in the SS garrison area, including the bodies of guards. These images became part of the extensive photographic record of the liberation, but were treated differently from the photographs of the prisoners and the camp facilities. The bodies of SS guards did not appear in the newspapers and magazines that published the liberation photographs. The story that reached the American public was focused entirely and appropriately on the survivors, and the evidence of the camp's operation and the killings of guards were not part of the narrative that was presented to civilian audiences in the spring of 1945. This selective presentation was not accidental. The Army's public affairs apparatus was making real-time decisions about what to release and how to frame the liberation story, and those decisions reflected both the genuine priority of documenting the camp's crimes and a clear preference for not having the liberation complicated by questions about American soldiers killing surrendered German personnel. The investigation was proceeding simultaneously with the public documentation effort, and the result was a kind of institutional bifurcation. The public story was the liberation, while the private story, the one being investigated and eventually suppressed, was what had happened to the guards. Sergeant Ruby Bradley, a nurse with the Army who was among the first medical personnel to enter the camp in the days following liberation, provided one of the most detailed medical accounts of the survivors' condition. Bradley was an extraordinary figure in her own right, having previously been a prisoner of war of the Japanese in the Philippines for more than 3 years before her liberation in early 1945. She'd come directly from that experience into the European theatre, and the combination of her own experience as a prisoner and her professional training as a nurse gave her a unique perspective on what she saw at Dachau. Her reports on the medical condition of the survivors, which detailed the specific effects of years of starvation and disease, were among the more medically precise documents produced in the immediate aftermath of the liberation and helped guide the Army's emergency medical response in the crucial first days. The medical challenge at Dachau was extraordinary in its scale and complexity, with tens of thousands of survivors in varying states of physical collapse, and with resources that were necessarily limited in the immediate aftermath of an active military operation. Army doctors and nurses were making triage decisions under pressure that had no real precedent. Some of the decisions made in those first days about how to feed survivors, how to treat the most severe cases of malnutrition, and how to manage the typhus epidemic that was rampaging through the prisoner population had life and death consequences that played out over the weeks following liberation. The historical record suggests that the Army did a creditable job under the circumstances, but also that the sheer scale of the suffering and the lack of adequate preparation for a medical emergency of this magnitude meant that some survivors who had lived through 12 years of Dachau died in the days and weeks immediately following liberation. The presence of prisoners from dozens of different countries, speaking dozens of different languages, added another layer of complexity to the liberation process. Dachau at the time of liberation held survivors from across Europe, including French, Polish, Czech, Austrian, Yugoslav, Italian, Greek, Dutch, Belgian, Norwegian, Soviet, and many other national groups, as well as German political prisoners who had been in the camp since its earliest days. The task of identifying prisoners, determining their nationalities, arranging repatriation, and providing appropriate support was one that would take months to accomplish, and it required the involvement of multiple Allied and neutral governments, the Red Cross, and the newly forming United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Among the prisoners liberated at Dachau were a number of individuals who would go on to play significant roles in the post-war world. The most famous was the French social politician and former Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, who had been imprisoned at Dachau since his deportation from France in 1943. Daladier, who had been one of the signatories of the Munich Agreement in 1938, the agreement that had conceded Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland to Hitler in an attempt to appease German territorial ambitions, had subsequently been arrested by the Vichy French government and handed over to the Germans. His presence at Dachau and his liberation by American forces was a diplomatic as well as a military event, and the French government's interest in his fate was intense. He was among the more physically robust survivors and was able to walk out of the camp on the day of liberation, though he required medical attention in the subsequent days and weeks. The liberation also freed a number of Catholic clergy who had been imprisoned at Dachau, including priests from across German-occupied Europe who had been confined in a special barracks within the camp. The Priesterblock, or priests' barracks, had at various points held more than 2,000 clergymen, making Dachau the largest site of imprisonment for clergy in the entire Nazi concentration camp system. By the time of liberation, many of these men had died, but hundreds survived, and their liberation was noted with particular attention by the Catholic Church. The Pope at the time, Pius XII, was deeply interested in the fate of imprisoned clergy, and Vatican diplomatic channels had been active in trying to obtain information about them throughout the war, with limited success. Among the surviving clergy liberated at Dachau was Blessed Karl Leisner, a German Catholic deacon who had been ordained as a priest in secret within the camp in December 1944, the only such ordination ever known to have taken place inside a concentration camp. Leisner had been imprisoned since 1939 for a remark he made criticizing Hitler following an assassination attempt, and his health had been badly damaged by his years in the camp. He was liberated at Dachau, but died in August 1945 from the tuberculosis that his imprisonment had exacerbated. He was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1996 in a ceremony at the site of the former Munich Olympic Stadium. The investigation into what had happened at Dachau during the liberation was formally opened within days of the event. The Inspector General's section of the 7th United States Army, which had responsibility for the area where Dachau fell, assigned investigators to interview witnesses, collect statements, and compile a report. The investigation was conducted by Colonel J. W. Younger and other officers of the Inspector General's staff, and it proceeded with a degree of thoroughness that might surprise those who assume military investigations in wartime are inherently superficial. The investigators took their job seriously. They interviewed dozens of soldiers. They took statements from officers, including Sparks. They examined the physical evidence in the camp. They tried to establish as precisely as the circumstances allowed exactly what had happened, in what sequence, and who was responsible. The resulting report was a detailed document that named specific soldiers as having participated in the killings of surrendered SS guards. It concluded that the killings in the coal yard and elsewhere in the camp constituted violations of the laws of war, and that there was evidence sufficient to support court-martial proceedings against the soldiers involved. The report also acknowledged the extraordinary context in which the killings had occurred, describing the death train and the condition of the prisoner compound, and noting that the soldiers had been operating under severe emotional stress, produced by genuinely unprecedented circumstances. But it didn't use those circumstances as a legal justification for what had happened, because legally they were not a justification. The report went up the chain of command and eventually reached General Patton. And there, with Patton's decision not to forward the recommendations for prosecution, the official process ended. Patton wrote in his response to the investigation that he did not believe the soldiers involved should be prosecuted, and his position as Army Group Commander gave him the authority to make that determination effectively final. The soldiers named in the investigation were not court-martialed. They were not formally disciplined. They returned to their units and eventually to civilian life, carrying the knowledge of what they had done and what had been done to protect them from the legal consequences of it. Felix Sparks's post-war life is a story of remarkable achievement that stands in interesting contrast to the darkness of his wartime experience. He returned to the University of Arizona after his discharge from the Army and completed his law degree, then embarked on a legal and political career in Colorado that would eventually take him to the Colorado Supreme Court. He served as a justice on that court from 1976 to 1990. A tenure of 14 years during which he earned a reputation as a careful and principled jurist. He was also active in Veterans Affairs and in historical preservation efforts related to the 45th Infantry Division's wartime service. The Thunderbird Museum in Oklahoma City maintains extensive records of the division's history, and Sparks contributed substantially to that historical record through his own writings and testimony. His relationship with the events at Dachau evolved over the decades following the war. In the immediate post-war years, he was as reluctant as most veterans to discuss the details of what had happened, partly because of the ongoing sensitivity around the suppressed investigation, and partly because of the general societal tendency of the 1940s and 1950s to encourage veterans to put the war behind them and get on with their lives. But as he aged, and as the historical discussion of the liberation of Dachau became more open and more detailed, Sparks began to engage more directly with the subject. He gave interviews to historians and journalists. He wrote a memoir account. He participated in documentary films about the liberation. And in all of these, he maintained the same fundamental position, that what his soldiers had done was wrong, that he had tried to stop it, and that the context which had produced it was one that he believed most people, had they been placed in the same circumstances, would have found overwhelming. Sparks died on June 28, 2007, at the age of 89 in Denver, Colorado. He had lived to see the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau, and he had lived long enough to see a substantial body of historical scholarship and documentary record develop around the events of April 29, 1945. His obituaries noted his distinguished legal career on the Colorado Supreme Court, his decades of military service, and his role in the liberation of Dachau, including both his intervention to stop the killing and his honest engagement with the historical record of what had occurred there. He was buried with full military honours, a soldier who had seen more than most men see, and who had tried, imperfectly and under conditions of extreme difficulty, to maintain the standards he believed in. The man who had surrendered the camp to the Americans, SS Untersturmführer Heinrich Wicker, had a very different post-war trajectory. Wicker was a young SS officer, born in 1918, who had been thrust into the invidious position of being the last German authority at Dachau as the Americans approached. He had been left with a garrison that was depleted by desertion and flight, a population of tens of thousands of desperately ill prisoners, and no good options of any kind. His decision to cooperate with the Red Cross representative Victor Maurer and to approach the Americans for a formal surrender rather than attempting to fight or flee was, in the circumstances, a reasonable one, and it may well have saved lives that would otherwise have been lost in a final spasm of resistance or in a disorganized collapse of order within the camp. Wicker was taken into American custody on April 29, 1945, and was held as a prisoner of war. He was interrogated extensively in the months following the war as part of the various investigations and documentation efforts related to Dachau. He provided accounts of the camp's administration in its final months, the evacuation of prisoners from other camps, and the conditions in the last weeks before liberation. He was not, however, among the most senior SS personnel at Dachau, and the primary focus of war crimes investigations related to the camp fell on those who had held command authority over longer periods and who could be linked to specific acts of murder and cruelty against prisoners. The last commandant of Dachau in any meaningful operational sense was Martin Gottfried Weiss, who had commanded the camp from September 1942 to November 1943 and then again briefly in the final months of the war. Weiss was born in 1905 and had been a professional member of the SS concentration camp administration from its earliest days. He had commanded multiple camps in the system, including Neuengamme in northern Germany, and was considered by the SS hierarchy a competent and reliable camp administrator, which in the language of the SS concentration camp system meant someone who could maintain productivity from prisoner labour while keeping mortality at levels that did not disrupt operations more than necessary. The distinction between efficient murder and inefficient murder was one that the SS administration actually made in writing in its internal documents, and it is one of the more chilling aspects of the historical record. Weiss was captured by American forces and was brought before the Dachau Military Tribunal, a series of American military trials conducted at the Dachau complex itself in 1945 and 1946, specifically to prosecute crimes committed at the camp and its subcamps. The use of Dachau itself as the location for these trials had a deliberate symbolic dimension. The perpetrators were to be judged in the place where their crimes had been committed. The Dachau Military Tribunal tried in total more than 1,600 individuals over the course of approximately 3 years, making it one of the largest war crimes trial proceedings of the post-war period in terms of the number of defendants. Martin Weiss was tried in the first major proceeding at the Dachau Tribunal, a case involving 40 defendants who had held various positions in the Dachau concentration camp administration. The trial began in November 1945 and ran for several weeks. The evidence presented was extensive and damning. Testimony from survivors, documentary records of the camp's administration, evidence regarding medical experiments conducted on prisoners, and documentation of mass killings. Weiss was convicted and sentenced to death. He was hanged at Landsberg prison on May 29, 1946, 41 years old, having gone from efficient camp administrator to executed war criminal in the space of a year. Among the other defendants in the first Dachau tribunal proceeding was SS Hauptsturmführer Friedrich Ruppert, who had served as the camp's Schutzhaftlagerführer, or protective custody camp leader, for an extended period and who was directly responsible for the daily administration of the prisoner compound. Ruppert was charged with participation in common design to commit war crimes, a legal theory that the American prosecutors used extensively at the Dachau trials, and which allowed them to prosecute individuals who had been part of the overall administration of the camp, even when specific individual acts could not always be directly documented. This common design theory was legally innovative and remained somewhat controversial even among American jurists, but it enabled the prosecution of a far larger number of individuals than would have been possible under more traditional standards of individual criminal liability. Ruppert was also convicted and sentenced to death and was hanged at Landsberg on the same day as Weiss. The first commandant of Dachau, SS Brigadeführer Hilmar Weckler, had commanded the camp only briefly in its very first weeks of operation, from March to June 1933. He was notable for having established some of the camp's most brutal early practices and for having been briefly investigated by a German state court in 1933 for the killing of prisoners, investigations that were quickly suppressed by the Nazi state. Weckler later served in the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front, rising to command the 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking for a brief period in 1941, before being killed in action near the Prut River in Russia on July 2, 1941. His death in combat spared him the reckoning that awaited the administrators who survived the war, but it also meant that one of the founding figures of the Dachau camp system died without any accounting for what he had established there. Theodor Aika was the man who truly shaped Dachau and the broader concentration camp system, and his story is central to understanding what the men who served under him became. Aika was born in 1892 in Hampont, Alsace, then part of the German Empire, and he had a troubled career before finding his purpose in the SS. He had been dismissed from the German police for his extremist political activities, and he had at one point been confined to a psychiatric facility after threatening SS leader Himmler's deputy. Despite this chaotic personal history, Himmler appointed him Commandant of Dachau in June 1933, and it was under Aika that the camp became the model institution for the entire concentration camp network. Aika introduced the structured brutality that would define the camps, the detailed regulations for guard behavior, the comprehensive system of punishments for prisoners, the specific procedures for executions, and the organizational structures that separated guards from prisoners in ways designed to maximize control and minimize individual moral hesitation about inflicting suffering. Aika later commanded the SS Totenkopf Division on the Eastern Front, where his military record was marked by both tactical skill and documented atrocities. He was killed when his reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over the Kharkov region of Ukraine on February 26, 1943, dying before he could be held accountable for what he had created. The concentration camp system he designed continued operating without him for another 2 years, its procedures so thoroughly institutionalized that it needed no individual genius to maintain it. That was perhaps the most terrifying thing about Aika's creation. It had been designed to run itself. The man who ran Dachau for much of the middle period of the war, from November 1943 to September 1944, was SS Standartenführer Alex Piłkowski. Piłkowski was born in 1902 and had been a member of the SS since the early 1930s. Under his administration, conditions in the camp deteriorated significantly as the prisoner population increased and the resources available to maintain the camp declined under the pressures of war. He was responsible for a period in which prisoner mortality at Dachau was particularly high. Piłkowski was captured, tried before the Dachau tribunal, convicted of war crimes and sentenced to death. His case was one of the many processed through the tribunal system that operated at the Dachau facility itself, and his execution at Landsberg on October 22, 1948, was one of the last carried out under the Dachau tribunal's jurisdiction. The medical crimes at Dachau deserve particular attention because they represent a dimension of the camp's operation that reached a specific kind of horror even within the general horror of the place. Beginning in 1942 and continuing until liberation, SS doctors conducted a series of experiments on prisoners that violated every principle of medical ethics and caused enormous suffering and many deaths. The experiments fell into several categories. Altitude experiments conducted in a low-pressure chamber subjected prisoners to simulated high-altitude conditions to determine the limits of human physiological tolerance, with the stated goal of helping the Luftwaffe understand the risks faced by its pilots. The experiments were directly fatal in many cases, as the subjects were taken to pressures and altitudes far beyond what the human body can survive. Freezing experiments subjected prisoners to extreme cold, either in tanks of ice water or exposed in the open air in winter conditions, again to serve Luftwaffe research interests. The suffering involved in these experiments was extreme, and many subjects died as a direct result. Malaria experiments infected prisoners with malaria parasites and then tested various pharmaceutical treatments, causing repeated bouts of high fever and in some cases death from the disease itself or its complications. Seawater experiments forced prisoners to drink only seawater for extended periods to test whether seawater could be processed into a drinkable form for use by pilots downed at sea, with predictable and agonizing results as the subjects' kidneys failed under the salt load. These experiments were not conducted in secrecy. They were reported through official SS channels and were known to senior leadership in the SS medical establishment. They were presented as scientific research in service of the war effort, and they received funding and institutional support as such. The primary SS physician responsible for conducting these experiments at Dachau was S-Hauptsturmführer Siegmund Rasche. Rasche was born in 1909 and had a medical degree from the University of Munich. He had also cultivated a connection to Himmler through his relationship with Himmler's mistress, and this personal connection gave him unusual access to resources and institutional support for his research program at Dachau. He was, by every historical account, a man who had completely abandoned any pretense of medical ethics in favor of the opportunity to conduct experiments on human subjects without the usual constraints that human civilization imposes on such activities. The experiments he conducted were not fringe activities carried out despite official disapproval. They were sanctioned, supported, and celebrated within the SS medical establishment. Rasche's fate was peculiar even by the standards of the SS. In 1944, Himmler ordered his arrest on charges of fraud, specifically the allegation that Rasche and his wife had falsely claimed to have given birth to children who were in fact kidnapped. He was imprisoned, first in Buchenwald and then in Dachau itself, the concentration camp he had used for his own experiments now serving as his prison. He was shot and killed at Dachau on April 26, 1945, 3 days before the American liberation, apparently on Himmler's orders. It is one of the more bizarre episodes of the camp's final days that the man who had conducted some of Dachau's most notorious experiments was himself killed there by the organization he had served, not for his crimes against prisoners, but for having deceived his patron. The broader network of medical crimes at Dachau was addressed at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials held by American authorities in the U.S. occupation zone between December 1946 and August 1947. 23 individuals were tried in the doctors' trial, and the evidence presented included extensive documentation of the Dachau experiments alongside medical crimes committed at other camps and facilities. The trial produced verdicts that included death sentences for 7 defendants, life imprisonment sentences for 5, and prison terms of varying length for 4 more, with 7 acquittals. The 7 who were sentenced to death, including Karl Gebhardt, Rudolf Brandt and Joachim Mrugowski, were executed at Landsberg on June 2, 1948. The Nuremberg doctors' trial also produced, as one of its lasting historical legacies, the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical principles for human experimentation that was articulated in the judgment, and which has served as a foundational document for medical ethics in the decades since. The Code's 10 principles, which include the requirement for voluntary informed consent, the principle that experiments must be designed to produce socially useful results that cannot be obtained by other means, and the principle that subjects must be able to withdraw from experiments at any time, emerged directly from the court's analysis of what had made the Nazi medical experiments criminal. In this way, the crimes committed at Dachau and other camps produced, through the mechanism of the trial process, a positive contribution to human civilization's understanding of what medicine is and what it must never do. One of the most important testimonies at the doctor's trial came from a survivor of the Dachau experiments, a French prisoner named Léon Blum, who had endured the altitude experiments and who provided detailed first-hand testimony about the conditions under which they had been conducted and the suffering they had caused. Blum's testimony, like that of many survivors who testified at Nuremberg and at the Dachau tribunal, was crucial in establishing the factual basis for the verdicts. The survivor testimonies were also historically significant beyond their legal function, as they constituted an archive of first-hand experience that would inform historical understanding of the Nazi camp system for generations. Let us now turn to the specific individuals among the SS garrison at Dachau who survived the liberation and faced trial, and trace their paths through the post-war justice system. The Dachau Military Tribunal, as noted, was the most extensive American war crimes trial proceeding in terms of the number of defendants, and it addressed not only crimes committed at the Dachau main camp, but also crimes committed at the numerous subcamps that were part of the Dachau network, as well as war crimes committed by SS guards against American prisoners of war. This last category included the trial related to the Malmedy massacre, in which Waffen-SS soldiers had killed American prisoners during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, a case that would become highly controversial in its own right due to allegations of coerced confessions and questions about the fairness of the proceedings. The Malmedy case, formerly known as the Malmedy Massacre Trial or United States versus Valentin Bersin et al., was tried at Dachau in 1946. It involved 73 defendants, including SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper, who had commanded the SS battle group responsible for the Malmedy killings. The case produced guilty verdicts against all 73 defendants and death sentences for 43 of them, but the case was subsequently reviewed amid serious allegations that American investigators had used coercive methods, including mock executions, physical abuse, and psychological pressure to obtain confessions from the defendants. A Senate subcommittee investigation in 1949, led by Senator Raymond Baldwin of Connecticut, found that some of the allegations were credible, and the case became a significant episode in the broader debate about the conduct of Allied war crimes trials in the post-war period. All of the death sentences in the Malmedy case were eventually commuted, and Jochen Peiper himself, who had received a death sentence, was released from prison in 1956 after serving 10 years. Peiper's subsequent life was itself controversial. He worked in various capacities in West Germany and eventually moved to France, where he lived under his own name in the village of Traves in Burgundy. He had made enemies who had not forgotten what he had done, and on the night of July 13th to 14th, 1976, his house was attacked, set on fire, and burned to the ground. His body was found in the ruins. He was 61 years old. No one was ever prosecuted for his killing, and the identities of those responsible, almost certainly individuals or groups connected to the French resistance veteran community, were never officially established. The question of whether Peiper's death constituted justice or murder, and what distinction, if any, exists between those categories when the victim had himself committed mass murder of prisoners of war, is one that echoes very directly the questions raised by what happened at Dachau on April 29, 1945. In both cases, the perpetrators of documented killings of helpless prisoners were themselves subsequently killed by people who had personal or political reasons to hate them. In both cases, the killings occurred outside any legal process, and in both cases, the emotional logic of the killings was comprehensible even to those who condemned the acts themselves. What does it mean when the killings of those who killed without legal authority are themselves treated as something to be investigated, suppressed, or quietly permitted without prosecution? That question does not have a simple answer, and the history of the post-war justice system for Nazi war crimes suggests that those who administered that system were never entirely comfortable with the tensions it contained. The Allies had committed in principle to applying consistent standards of law, regardless of the nationality of the perpetrators. In practice, those standards were applied inconsistently, reflecting political pressures, resource constraints, evolving Cold War priorities, and the simple human difficulty of maintaining rigorous legal procedures in the aftermath of an unimaginably destructive war. The 45th Infantry Division's involvement at Dachau did not end on the day of liberation. Elements of the division remained in the area for a period, providing security for the camp and its survivors while the administrative transition to more permanent occupation forces was organized. The soldiers who had participated in the liberation continued to process what they had experienced, and the Army's medical personnel, recognizing that combat stress of an unusual and severe kind had affected many of the soldiers involved, made some effort to provide support, though the understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder was far less developed in 1945 than it would become in subsequent decades. Many of the veterans of Dachau's liberation did not speak about their experiences publicly for decades. The combination of the suppressed investigation, the general societal expectation that veterans would move on from their wartime experiences, and the genuine difficulty of communicating what they had seen to people who had not been there, produced a long period of relative silence. Veterans of the 45th Division and 42nd Division who had been at Dachau returned to civilian life in the United States, resumed their careers and family lives, and generally kept what they had seen locked inside them in the way that many combat veterans do. The effects of that suppression were sometimes visible in their subsequent lives, in recurring nightmares, in emotional volatility, in difficulty with intimate relationships, in tendencies toward heavy drinking, in the generalized emotional numbing that trauma produces in those who survive it. The gradual breaking of that silence is one of the more significant developments in the historiography of the liberation of Dachau. Beginning in the 1970s, some veterans began to speak to historians and journalists, and the accounts they provided added crucial texture and specificity to the historical record that had been officially suppressed. The publication of Sparks's memoirs and interviews, the development of the Holocaust education movement, and the increasing academic focus on the liberation of the concentration camps all contributed to a growing body of testimony from those who had been there. By the 1990s and 2000s, with the veterans of the liberation now elderly, and many of them feeling a responsibility to ensure that their experiences were documented before they passed, the oral history record of Dachau's liberation had become substantial. The Shoah Foundation, established by Steven Spielberg following the making of Schindler's List in 1993, collected extensive video testimony from both survivors of the concentration camps and from the soldiers who had liberated them. The testimonies of Dachau survivors and liberators that the Foundation collected represent one of the most important archives of primary experience related to the liberation, and they have been used extensively by educators, historians, and documentary filmmakers in the years since. The project's methodological commitment to allowing individuals to tell their stories in their own words, at whatever length they needed, produced accounts of remarkable depth and specificity that more structured historical interviews sometimes fail to capture. Another survivor whose account became particularly significant in the historical record was the Czech writer and journalist Egon Zischke, who had been imprisoned at Dachau and who later wrote extensively about his experiences there. Zischke's accounts, published in Czech and subsequently translated, describe the interior life of the camp from the perspective of a politically sophisticated and observant witness, and they provided historians with a view of Dachau's operation from the inside that complemented the administrative and military records maintained by the Germans and the documentation produced by American forces after liberation. His description of the morning of April 29, 1945, when the American soldiers first appeared, conveyed the mixture of disbelief, joy, and physical incapacity that characterized the experience of surviving prisoners, many of whom were too ill to do more than register the reality of liberation without being able to respond to it in any physically demonstrable way. The testimony of former prisoner Nerin Gun, a Turkish journalist who had been imprisoned at Dachau from 1942 to 1945, was particularly valuable for the historical record because Gun combined first-hand experience with journalistic skills and produced a detailed memoir published in 1956 in Turkish and later translated into multiple languages that documented the camp's internal organization, the prisoner community's social structures, and the events of the final months before liberation. Gunn's account of the liberation itself described the confusion and emotion of the day from the perspective of someone inside the wire watching the Americans arrive, and it included observations about the killings of guards that complemented the accounts from the American side. He wrote about hearing the shooting and understanding what it represented, and he described the complex emotional response of prisoners who were simultaneously grateful to their liberators and aware that what was happening to the guards fell outside any formal legal process. The German priest Franz Goldschmidt, who had been imprisoned at Dachau's priest's barracks and who survived the liberation, later provided extensive testimony about the camp from the perspective of the clerical prisoners. Goldschmidt's account was notable for its attention to the spiritual and psychological dimensions of imprisonment, and for its description of the community that the imprisoned clergy had formed within the camp as a means of maintaining human connection and religious practice in the most adverse circumstances imaginable. His testimony about the Liberation Day included observations about the behavior of both the American soldiers and the SS guards in those final hours, and it contributed to a more three-dimensional understanding of an event that had been described primarily through military and journalistic sources. Among the American soldiers who liberated Dachau and who later gave extensive testimony was Lieutenant William Cowling, a young officer with the 42nd Infantry Division whose letters home, written in the immediate aftermath of the liberation, became among the most widely cited primary sources for the event. Cowling's letters were written in real time, in the hours and days immediately following April 29, 1945, when his memories were fresh and his emotional responses were immediate and unmediated by the passage of time or the influence of subsequent accounts. He described the death train with a directness that made his letters difficult to read and impossible to forget. He wrote about entering the prisoner compound and being surrounded by survivors who were reaching for him and his comrades, and about the inability of ordinary language to capture what he was experiencing. His letters were preserved by his family and were eventually donated to historical archives, where they became reference points for historians seeking to understand the emotional reality of the liberation from the American soldiers' perspective. Staff Sergeant Donald Montgomery, another veteran of the liberation who served with the 45th Infantry Division, gave detailed oral history testimony in the 1990s that addressed the killings of SS guards directly. Montgomery had been in areas of the camp where he witnessed American soldiers shooting guards who had surrendered, and he struggled in his testimony to explain the emotional and cognitive state that had produced those actions. He described a kind of collective moral suspension, a state in which the normal inhibitions that govern human behavior in relation to violence were simply not functioning, overridden by the accumulated weight of what the soldiers had seen. He was explicit that he understood the killings were wrong, and he was equally explicit that he understood why they had happened, and he expressed the view that anyone who had not been present at Dachau that morning could not reliably predict how they would have behaved in the same circumstances. Montgomery's testimony also addressed the aftermath of the liberation and the process by which the army investigated what had happened. He described the investigators coming to interview soldiers in the days following April 29th and the mixture of cooperation and defensiveness with which soldiers approached those interviews. Some soldiers were forthcoming, others were more guarded, understanding that they might be implicated in something that the army considered a criminal violation. The investigation, as Montgomery described it from the perspective of a soldier being investigated rather than an officer conducting the inquiry, had a surreal quality to it, occurring as it did in the midst of the ongoing military operations of a still active war and in the physical presence of the camp itself, which remained both a crime scene and a medical emergency. The role of General George Patton in the Dachau story merits further examination beyond his decision to suppress the investigation. And Patton's visit to the camp in the days following liberation was, by his own account, a shattering experience. He had seen the aftermath of battle, he had ordered operations that he knew would produce mass casualties, and he had presided over the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers under his command. But the evidence of systematic bureaucratic mass murder that he encountered at Dachau affected him in a way that battlefield violence apparently had not. And this response tells us something interesting about the psychology of even the most hardened military commanders. Patton's diary entries from the days following his Dachau visit are among the more emotionally transparent things he ever wrote. He described his reaction to the crematorium, to the piles of bodies, to the condition of the survivors, in terms that convey genuine moral revulsion. He also described his inability to complete the inspection tour, which was uncharacteristic for a man who prided himself on his physical and psychological toughness. Whatever the complexities and contradictions of Patton's character, and they were numerous, his response to Dachau was not that of a man who was indifferent to human suffering. It was the response of a man who had encountered something that exceeded the categories his experience had provided for processing atrocity. His subsequent decision not to pursue charges against the soldiers who had killed SS guards can be seen in this context as an expression of the same emotional reality that had produced the killings in the first place. Patton understood because he shared it, the visceral human response to what those soldiers had seen. His decision to protect them from prosecution was arguably a failure of his responsibility as a commander to enforce the laws of war consistently, but it was also, in a human sense, comprehensible in a way that the abstract application of legal principle to extreme circumstances often is not. The question of whether comprehensibility constitutes justification is one that this story repeatedly poses without answering, because it is a question that does not have an answer that is both honest and simple. The broader question of American conduct in the liberation of the concentration camps extends beyond Dachau. American forces liberated several other camps in the spring of 1945, including Nordhausen, Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, and Mauthausen. And in several of these liberations, there were incidents in which American soldiers killed German guards or other personnel in circumstances that raised questions about compliance with the laws of war. The incidents were generally handled in the same way as the Dachau killings: investigated briefly, acknowledged in internal military documentation, and then suppressed without prosecution. This pattern suggests that Dachau was not an isolated aberration, but was rather one instance of a broader phenomenon in which the emotional impact of the concentration camp discoveries repeatedly overwhelmed the capacity of soldiers to maintain their legal obligations toward captured enemies. The legal and ethical framework that governed these situations was articulated in the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions, which the United States had signed and was therefore bound to apply. These international agreements required, among other things, that prisoners of war be treated humanely and that captured enemy personnel not be killed after they had surrendered. The American soldiers who killed SS guards at Dachau and elsewhere violated these rules, and their violation could not legally be excused by the emotional context in which it occurred, however understandable that context was from a human perspective. The laws of war are designed precisely to apply in situations where it is emotionally difficult to comply with them, because those are the only situations in which they matter. Yet the American military's decision not to prosecute in the Dachau case, and in similar cases elsewhere, reflected a practical judgment that the moral calculus in these situations was different from ordinary war crimes cases. The men who had killed SS guards at Dachau had themselves just encountered evidence of war crimes on a scale that dwarfed anything that their own actions constituted. The proportionality problem in these situations was not one that the existing legal framework was well equipped to handle, and the individuals in the army's chain of command who made the decision not to prosecute seem to have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that pressing charges in these circumstances would produce more injustice than it prevented. The subsequent history of war crimes prosecutions related to American military operations, including investigations into incidents in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, has repeatedly returned to the same fundamental tension. How do you apply legal standards of conduct to soldiers who are operating under extreme emotional stress and who have been placed in situations that test the limits of human psychological tolerance? The Dachau incident provides a historical data point for this discussion, one in which the decision not to prosecute was made by senior commanders and subsequently endorsed by silence at the highest levels of military authority. The fate of the Dachau camp itself after the liberation and the end of the war is a story that spans several decades. In the immediate post-war period, the facility served first as a detention center for SS and Nazi party members awaiting trial or processing, then as a displaced persons camp for the hundreds of thousands of European civilians who had been displaced by the war and could not or would not return to their countries of origin. Many of the displaced persons housed at the former Dachau complex in 1945 and 1946 were Jewish survivors of the concentration camp system who were waiting for the opportunity to emigrate to Palestine, which was then under British mandate and subject to restrictions on Jewish immigration that would not be lifted until Israeli independence in 1948. The use of the former concentration camp as a displaced persons facility was deeply uncomfortable for many of the survivors housed there, as well as for observers from outside. The physical infrastructure of the camp, the barracks, the wire, the towers, was still present, and the survivors were being housed in the same buildings in which they or their fellow prisoners had been held captive. The displaced persons camp at Dachau was eventually closed in 1948, and thereafter the facility went through several transformations of use, including as a residential complex for German refugees from the Eastern Territories and as a West German police training facility. The Memorialization of Dachau as a historical site and museum is a process that began in the 1950s but did not achieve its full development until much later. German survivors' organizations and international Jewish organizations pressed for the preservation of the site and the creation of a memorial, while local German authorities were often reluctant to maintain a facility that was a reminder of the Nazi past. The tension between those who wanted to remember and those who wanted to forget played out at Dachau, as it did across West Germany. And the resolution of that tension in favour of memorialisation was a gradual process that reflected the broader arc of West German engagement with its own history. The Dachau concentration camp memorial site was formally established in 1965, 20 years after the liberation. It included preserved portions of the original camp infrastructure, including the gatehouse with its famous Arbeit macht frei sign, reconstructed barracks, the crematorium, and the locations of the gas chamber. An international documentation centre and museum was established to provide historical context for visitors. The site has received millions of visitors in the decades since its establishment, and it has become one of the most significant Holocaust memorial sites in the world, drawing visitors from Germany and internationally who come to bear witness to what happened there and to confront the evidence of what human beings are capable of inflicting on one another. The question of what the Dachau Memorial Site should emphasize and how it should present the events of April 29, 1945, including the killings of SS guards, has been a matter of ongoing discussion among the site's administrators, historians, and advocacy groups. For many years, the memorial's focus was almost entirely on the suffering and deaths of the camp's prisoners, and the events of Liberation Day were presented in a way that emphasized the arrival of American soldiers and the freeing of the prisoners, without dwelling on the more complicated aspects of what had occurred. The killings of guards were not the central story that the memorial wanted to tell, and there were legitimate reasons for that choice, given that the priority of Holocaust education is appropriately focused on the victims and the machinery of their persecution. But as the historiography of the liberation became more detailed and more honest, the memorial site began to address the killings more directly. The tension between wanting to present the American liberators in a straightforwardly heroic light, which was both politically convenient and emotionally satisfying, and the obligation to present the full historical truth, including the parts of that truth that were morally complicated, was one that the memorial wrestled with over several decades. By the early 21st century, the memorial was addressing the killings of SS guards as part of its comprehensive presentation of Liberation Day, placing them in context while neither excusing nor sensationalizing them. The broader debate about the morality of what happened at Dachau has never fully subsided, and it probably never will, because the events of April 29, 1945 touch on questions about human nature, justice, vengeance, and the limits of law that do not resolve cleanly. On one side of the debate are those who argue that the killings of SS guards were war crimes, full stop, and that the failure to prosecute them was a failure of the Allied commitment to the rule of law that established a damaging precedent. On the other side are those who argue that the men who killed SS guards at Dachau were responding in a human and in some sense morally coherent way to an inhuman situation, and that prosecuting them would have been a grotesque misapplication of legal principle. Both positions have serious advocates, and neither fully satisfies the moral intuitions of most people who think carefully about the case. What is generally agreed upon by historians who have studied the events is that the killings happened, that they were not justified by existing law, that the men who committed them were responding to genuine emotional extremity produced by genuine atrocity, and that the decision not to prosecute them reflected a pragmatic judgment that was comprehensible but legally questionable. The historiography has also generally concluded that the most extreme claims about the scale of the killings, particularly Buechner's assertion of 520 dead, are not supported by the evidence, and that the more modest figures produced by the Army's own investigation, somewhere in the range of 17 to 40, are more historically reliable, even though exact verification remains impossible. Howard Buechner himself is an interesting figure in the story's historiography. His 1986 book, Dachau, The Hour of the Avenger, written under the pen name Howard Weiss, claimed to provide a detailed account of the events of April 29, 1945, based on his first-hand experience as a medical officer present at the liberation. The book's central claim that 520 SS guards were systematically executed by American soldiers under orders from an officer Buechner identified only by a pseudonym generated considerable attention when it was published and has continued to circulate in popular accounts of the liberation. However, historians who have examined Buechner's claims against the documentary evidence have generally found them unsupported and, in some respects, demonstrably incorrect. The Army's investigation, conducted immediately after the events while evidence was fresh and witnesses were available, produced a far lower figure, and there is no documentary evidence from any source that corroborates the 520 claim. Buechner's motivations for publishing the claims he did have been the subject of speculation. Some historians have suggested that his account reflects a genuine but distorted memory, shaped by the emotional intensity of the day and the passage of 40 years between the event and the publication. Others have been more skeptical about his reliability as a witness. What is clear is that the popularity of his account in certain circles reflects a broader human tendency to want a cleaner, more dramatic narrative of justice being served against the perpetrators of atrocity, even if that narrative requires inflating the numbers and simplifying the moral situation in ways that the historical record does not support. The story of Private First Class William Quinlan deserves a place in this account because it illustrates the individual human experience of liberation in a dimension that large-scale historical narratives sometimes obscure. Quinlan was a young infantryman with the 45th Division who had fought through the entire European campaign and who was among the soldiers who entered the Dachau prisoner compound on April 29, 1945. His account, provided in oral history interviews conducted in the 1990s, described the experience of having survivors approach him, press against him, grasp his hands and arms, and look at him with expressions that he found impossible to describe. He described one particular moment in which a prisoner who appeared to be about his own age, perhaps 20 or 21 years old, grasped his hand and would not let go, and he stood there holding this man's hand for what felt like a very long time, not knowing what to say or do, and understanding that saying or doing anything was probably less important than simply being present and allowing the contact. That image of a young American soldier and a young European prisoner standing in the Dachau compound on the morning of April 29, 1945, holding hands in a gesture of human connection that transcended language and all the categories of war and politics and nationality and religion that the preceding 6 years had attempted to make absolute, is as close to the essential meaning of the liberation as anything in the historical record. It does not resolve the moral questions. It does not excuse the killings of guards. It does not minimize the enormity of what the camp represented. But it captures something that all the military and legal and political analysis of the liberation tends to obscure, which is that at the center of the event were individual human beings, encountering each other across the most extreme boundary that human civilization had ever erected, and sometimes finding, in that encounter, something recognizably and irreducibly human. The question of how the American soldiers who liberated Dachau understood what they had done in the years following the war is one that the oral history record addresses in rich and complicated ways. Many veterans described a process of delayed emotional response, in which the full impact of what they had experienced did not arrive until months or years after the liberation, sometimes triggered by apparently unrelated events, sometimes by dreams, sometimes by nothing identifiable at all. The term post-traumatic stress disorder would not become a formal psychiatric diagnosis until 1980. But the phenomenon it names was abundantly present in the veterans of Dachau's liberation, long before the language existed to describe it. Nightmares about the death train, about the crematorium, about the faces of the survivors were reported by veterans across the decades following the war, and many of them described a persistent inability to discuss what they had experienced with people who had not been there. The relationship between the trauma of the liberation and the killings of SS guards is a dimension that the oral histories address with some care. Several veterans described the killings as a response that was partly driven by something beyond simple anger or vengeance, something more like a psychological breaking point at which the capacity for moral inhibition was simply not functioning under the weight of what the soldiers had seen. This description has resonance with what is now understood about acute stress reactions in trauma contexts, though the specific combination of combat stress accumulated over years of fighting and the sudden, concentrated exposure to evidence of mass atrocity that the Dachau soldiers experienced is probably unique in military history and may not map neatly onto other forms of combat trauma. One of the most poignant aspects of the veterans' accounts is the frequency with which they described feeling that nobody in their subsequent civilian lives could really understand what they had experienced at Dachau. The standard narrative of returning veterans from World War II in the popular culture of the 1940s and 1950s was one of heroic men coming home to rebuild their lives and contribute to a prosperous and optimistic America. That narrative had no room for the specific kind of moral complexity and psychological damage that the veterans of the concentration camp liberations carried. They had not just fought a war, they had encountered something that challenged the most fundamental assumptions about what human beings are and what human civilization is capable of, and they had to carry that encounter inside them for the rest of their lives without any cultural or institutional framework for processing it. The historian Robert Abzug, in his important work on the American liberation of the Nazi concentration camps, described the experience of the liberating soldiers as a kind of moral shock that produced lasting psychological consequences and that fundamentally altered the consciousness of those who experienced it. He argued that the soldiers who liberated the camps were witnesses in a specific and burdened sense, that what they had seen gave them a responsibility to testify that many of them felt acutely but found difficult to fulfill, because the experience resisted communication and because the society to which they returned was not fully prepared to receive what they had to communicate. The broader historical significance of the liberation of Dachau and of what happened there on April 29, 1945, extends far beyond the specific events of that day. The liberation of Dachau was one of the key moments in the process by which the Nazi concentration camp system was revealed to the world, and it contributed substantially to the construction of the post-war moral consensus that produced the Nuremberg trials, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Genocide Convention, and the broader framework of international human rights law that emerged from the rubble of World War II. The evidence that American soldiers and journalists documented at Dachau became part of the evidentiary foundation for the Nuremberg prosecutions, and the moral outrage that the documentation of the camps produced among Allied populations provided political support for the extraordinary assertion of international jurisdiction over war crimes that the Nuremberg process represented. The Nuremberg trials themselves, the International Military Tribunal that sat from November 1945 to October 1946 and tried 24 of the most senior surviving figures of the Nazi regime, were in many ways made possible by what had been found at Dachau and the other liberated camps. The documented reality of the concentration camp system was central to the prosecution's case, and the evidence of systematic mass murder was what distinguished the Nuremberg indictments from anything that international law had previously attempted to address. The creation of the crime of crimes against humanity as a legal category at Nuremberg was a direct response to the evidence of what the Nazi regime had done to the populations under its control, evidence that places like Dachau had preserved with terrible thoroughness. Among the defendants at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg was Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Reich Security Main Office, or RSHA, which was the SS agency responsible for overseeing the concentration camp system through its subsidiary agencies, including the Gestapo and the SD. Kaltenbrunner was born in 1903 in Riedem-Innkreis, Austria, and had been a committed Nazi from the early 1930s, rising rapidly through the Austrian SS before the Anschluss brought him into the broader German SS structure. After the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in Prague in May 1942, Kaltenbrunner was appointed to succeed him as head of the RSHA, making him one of the most powerful figures in the SS apparatus during the final 3 years of the war. As head of the RSHA, Kaltenbrunner bore direct institutional responsibility for the operation of the concentration camp system, including Dachau, during the period when that system was functioning at its most murderous. He oversaw the agencies that administered the camps, approved the orders that governed their operation, and received reports on their activities. His defense at E. Nuremberg attempted to portray him as a bureaucrat who had signed papers without understanding their full implications. But the evidence presented by the prosecution made clear that his knowledge of and responsibility for the crimes of the RSHA was comprehensive. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and was sentenced to death. He was hanged at Nuremberg prison on October 16, 1946, at the age of 43. Heinrich Himmler, who as head of the entire SS was ultimately responsible for the concentration camp system and who had personally overseen its expansion and intensification throughout the war, never faced the tribunal he deserved. Himmler had been arrested by British forces near the end of the war while attempting to escape in disguise, and on May 23, 1945, while being held by British military authorities, he committed suicide by biting down on a cyanide capsule concealed in his mouth. He was 44 years old. His death deprived the Nuremberg process of the individual who, more than any other single person, was responsible for the machinery of the Holocaust, and it is one of the enduring frustrations of the post-war justice effort that the man who sat at the center of the system that operated Dachau and all the other camps escaped any formal accounting for what he had done. Adolf Hitler, of course, had also escaped through suicide, dying on April 30, 1945, the day after the liberation of Dachau, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in on the city. It is one of the grimmer historical coincidences of the final days of the war that the day the American soldiers opened Dachau's gates was the day before the man who had ordered the camp system into existence ended his own life in the Berlin underground. The temporal proximity of these two events, the liberation of what had been built and the death of the man who had ordered it built, has a quality of historical near-simultaneity that historians have noted as striking, though it was, of course, entirely coincidental in terms of cause and effect. The American soldiers who liberated Dachau were not, by and large, men who thought of themselves as making history. They were doing their jobs in the way that they had been doing their jobs for months and years, and the specific job on April 29, 1945, was to take the town of Dachau and secure whatever military objective it contained. That the objective turned out to be a concentration camp, that what they found there would change them permanently and contribute to the historical record in ways that extended far beyond any individual soldier's understanding of his role, was not something they had anticipated or prepared for. But they bore witness to it, and some of them, eventually, found the words to describe what they had witnessed, and those words became part of the historical record, and that record became part of the foundation on which subsequent generations have built their understanding of what the Second World War was and what it meant. The legacy of Dachau's liberation in American military culture is complex and has evolved substantially over the decades since 1945. In the immediate post-war period, the liberation was remembered primarily as a moment of American heroism, a story about what the war was fought for and what it had cost to fight it. The killings of SS guards were not part of that narrative. As historical understanding of the liberation became more nuanced, the moral complexity of April 29, 1945 became more widely acknowledged, and the story was told with greater honesty about what had happened and why. This evolution in how the event is remembered reflects a broader American willingness, which has developed unevenly and with significant resistance, to engage with the moral complexity of its own conduct in war, including episodes where American soldiers behaved in ways that violated the standards they were nominally committed to upholding. For the survivors of Dachau, the liberation was both an end and a beginning. The end of imprisonment was also the beginning of a process of recovery that, for many, was lifelong and incomplete. The physical recovery from the effects of imprisonment was a matter of months for those whose bodies had not been irreparably damaged, though for many the physical consequences were permanent. The psychological recovery was a longer and more uncertain process. The survivors had to rebuild not only their personal lives but often their national and community contexts, in many cases returning to countries where their families and communities had been destroyed, where the neighbours who had known them before the war sometimes greeted their return with hostility or indifference rather than welcome, and where the broader society was often resistant to confronting what had happened to them and who had been responsible. The question of reparations for the survivors of Dachau and the other. Concentration camps was addressed through a series of agreements between West Germany and Israel and Jewish representative organizations, beginning with the Luxembourg Agreement of 1952. Under this agreement and subsequent legislation, West Germany committed to paying reparations to Holocaust survivors, and individual survivors could apply for compensation for the harm they had suffered. The reparations process was imperfect and in many cases inadequate to the scale of what had been done, but it represented a formal acknowledgement by the German state of its responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi period, and it provided material assistance to many survivors who needed it. The process of application for reparations was itself often painful for survivors, requiring them to document their experiences in detail and to engage with bureaucratic processes that sometimes felt dehumanizing or in ways that resonated uncomfortably with what they had experienced under the Nazi system. The last surviving veterans of Dachau's liberation have now passed away. The youngest of the soldiers who entered the camp on April 29, 1945, would be over 100 years old today, and even those who were teenagers at the time of liberation are no longer living. The direct testimony of those who were there, both the liberators and the liberated, has passed from the realm of living memory into the realm of historical record. This transition, which scholars of the Holocaust and World War II have written about extensively as the challenge of post-memorial historical transmission, means that the responsibility for keeping the memory of what happened at Dachau alive and accurate now rests with those who receive that memory second-hand, through documents, photographs, film footage, and the testimonies that the last generation of witnesses left for those who came after them. The story of what American soldiers did when they found Dachau is, in the end, a story about what human beings are and what they are capable of in both their worst and their most complicated dimensions. The soldiers who liberated the camp performed an act that was necessary and, in the broadest possible sense, right. They brought an end to 12 years of systematic torture and murder. They were among the first people to see and document the reality of the Nazi concentration camp system for the world. They cared for the survivors under conditions of extreme difficulty and inadequate resources. And some of them, in the specific circumstances of that specific day, also killed surrendered men in violation of the laws they were sworn to uphold, driven past the limits of their capacity for moral self-regulation by what they had encountered. Both things are true. The liberation of Dachau was an act of justice and a scene of extrajudicial killing. The soldiers who carried it out were heroes and, in a specific and bounded sense, perpetrators of acts that the law and the principles they believed in condemned. History does not always resolve its contradictions, and the events of April 29, 1945, are among the most instructive examples of that refusal to resolve. Felix Sparks, who intervened to stop the killing and who spent the rest of his long life trying to understand what he had witnessed, perhaps put the essential question most directly in one of his later interviews. He said that anyone who judged the soldiers of the 45th Division for what they had done at Dachau should first ask themselves what they would have done, having walked past that train, having seen those men in the compound, having smelled what was in the air at that camp on that morning. He was not asking the question as an excuse. He was asking it as an invitation to honest self-examination. He believed, and the historical evidence supports him, that what happened at Dachau was the product of circumstances that most human beings, placed in them, would have found overwhelming. Whether that is a comfort or an indictment of human nature is something each person must decide for themselves. The camp at Dachau still stands. Its preserved structures a monument to what was done there and to those who survived it. Hundreds of thousands of people visit it every year, walking through the gatehouse, passing between the barracks, standing at the edge of the roll call square, looking at the crematorium, reading the accounts of those who lived and died within its boundaries. Many of them leave in silence, or in tears, or simply unable to find words adequate to what they have seen. That difficulty of adequate response, that collision between the historical record and the limits of human comprehension, is perhaps the most honest inheritance from the morning of April 29, 1945, when the gates opened and American soldiers walked in and found what the world had somehow allowed to be built and maintained for 12 years in the middle of what called itself civilization. Well, that is it for today. We hope you found this video on the liberation of Dachau and what American soldiers did when they arrived at the camp to be both informative and thought-provoking. This is a chapter of World War II history that raises questions with no easy answers, and those questions deserve our continued attention and honest engagement. If you want to learn more about this period, make sure you check out our video on where the Waffen-SS went after 1945, and our video on what happened to the German generals after World War II. Both videos explore the fates of those who built and operated the machinery of the Third Reich, and what justice, partial and imperfect as it often was, looked like in the years that followed. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. We will see you in the next one. The story of Dachau cannot be understood in isolation from the broader story of what Germany was and what it chose to become during the 12 years of Nazi rule. The camp was not an aberration that existed outside the normal functioning of German society. It was embedded in that society, visible to the surrounding community, staffed by men who went home to their families at the end of their shifts, and supported by an administrative and political structure that extended from the camp gates all the way to the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. The people of the town of Dachau knew the camp existed. They knew something of what went on there. The smells that reached the town on days when the crematoria were working at full capacity were not a mystery. The convoys of prisoners moving through town, the columns of emaciated men marching to and from work sites, were not invisible. The degree of knowledge in the surrounding community and the degree of willful ignorance that that community chose to maintain is one of the questions that historians of the Nazi period have examined with particular attention, and the conclusions they have reached are uncomfortable for anyone who holds to a simple narrative of German civilians as innocent bystanders to crimes committed by a remote and self-contained regime. The soldiers who arrived at Dachau on April 29, 1945, were entering not just a camp but a system, and not just a system but a society, and their actions on that day, including the killings that have been at the centre of this account, need to be understood in relation to all of that context. They were young men from Oklahoma and Colorado and New Mexico who had spent 2.5 years fighting a war they hadn't started, and they had arrived at the logical endpoint of what that war was about. What they did there, in all its moral complexity, was what human beings do when they encounter the deepest contradictions of what it means to live in civilization and to be responsible for defending it,